What's happening to the American middle class? There's a fascinating piece published in the Washington Post yesterday afternoon by Eli Saslaw, writing for the Post, about this guy, Dave Ramsey Jr. His father, Dave Ramsey Sr., no relation to the talk show host, died at the age of 70 looking at a bill, at a medical bill that he couldn't afford to pay. Had a heart attack. And his son, was just flat out of money. I mean, Dad he'd had a number of reasonably good jobs throughout his life, but basically, the middle class just changed, or the ability to stay in the middle class changed during the last 20 or so years of his life. And he ended up deeper and deeper in debt, as did his son and his neighborhood to a large extent. And his son, Dave Jr., this is he had his father cremated, and all he could afford to pick up his dad's ashes was a cloth bag. He couldn't afford a funeral service. He couldn't afford a memorial service. He couldn't even afford an urn. It's really a remarkable story, and I highly recommend you check it out. One of the things that Eli Saslaw notes is that like a record 23% of Americans who have died in the past 5 years, the ultimate financial worth of Dave's father's life was nothing, a number somewhere below zero. And then Saslaw goes on to point out in the Washington Post that it's even worse than that, that Dave Jr.'s family is, quote, a case study in what economists call backward mobility into the bottom 50% of Americans who now collectively have a negative net worth. A negative net worth is like worse than just being in poverty. It means that you have to climb up to zero first in order to get out of it. There's basically no way to ever economically catch your breath or to sleep well at night without worrying. It also usually means, at least in the United States, that your children are probably also doomed to a life of grinding poverty, because America is now the least socially mobile country of all the developed nations in the world as a result of Republican tax policies. And so here we are. We went from 2/3 of Americans, when Ronald Reagan came into office, 2/3 of Americans being solidly middle class. The white population of America was solidly middle class, and the black and Hispanic population of America was rapidly moving into a middle class. Substantial black and Hispanic middle classes were beginning to emerge in the 60s and 70s and early 80s as a consequence, in large part, of not just the New Deal programs, but in particular, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. But now, all of us together, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, fewer than half of us are middle class. And in fact, more than 50% of all Americans own nothing. In fact, they owe rather than own. So how do we get here, and how do we reverse this? The way we got here, in a nutshell, is Reaganomics. Ronald Reagan coming in and cutting the top tax rate on morbidly rich people from 74% down to 25% for 1 year. Then it went back up to 28%. And it stayed pretty much in that neighborhood right up till now, low 30s anyway, high 20s. Cutting roughly in half the corporate tax rate. And going on an absolute rampage to destroy unions, because unions were the principal funders of the Democratic Party, and the goal of the Republican Party in the 1980s was to cut the money supply to the Democratic Party, to the DNC. And they were largely successful in doing this. It's why Bill Clinton felt that the Democrats had to start embracing, quote, clean industries, like banking and insurance and big pharma, big hospitals, stuff like that. Which was, you could argue he really had no choice. You could argue. I would argue that actually he did have a choice, and he could have gone all Bernie Sanders in 1992. but chose not to. But that's all. That's a, you know, kind of litigating 1992 is probably not the best thing to be doing right now. But the bottom line here is that Reagan flipped us out of New Deal economics, which had sustained us from 1933 right up until 1981, and into neoliberal Reaganomics, the trickle-down economics, which always destroys middle classes. Always. So how do we fix this? Well, it's pretty straightforward stuff. Number one, we have to get money out of politics, because the problem is that the oligarchs don't want their taxes going up. You know, the morbidly rich people in America are paying, according to that Politico study last year, an average of around 3% income tax. It's a hell of a lot less than you pay, I can guarantee you that. Most people pay. But they're paid around 3% income tax. So, and they want to keep it that way, so that they can, you know, pour more and more money into their money bins. But, you know, so number one, get money out of politics. Reverse Citizens United. Number two, set a floor through which people can't fall with, you know, aggressive federal programs to get homeless people off the streets and into housing, to provide people with food who are food insecure, which is a shocking number of Americans. Guarantee workers the right to unionize and enforce that right vigorously. That right to unionize is something that you know, really built the American middle class. And like I said, that was the first thing Reagan went after. Next, provide health care at little to no cost so that no American family will ever again get wiped out by somebody getting sick or in an accident. In Canada, you know the number of people last year who declared bankruptcy because somebody in their family got sick in Canada? 0. Germany, 0. Sweden, 0. France, 0. Italy, 0. The United States, almost 1 million. I mean, you know, Dave Ramsey, the guy that this story is about in the Washington Post, he didn't declare bankruptcy, but it was medical debt that was wiping him out. So provide health care, provide higher education and trade school at little to no cost, so every American, regardless of social station, can reach their full potential. This is something that every other developed country in the world right now does routinely. College is free to cheap. In Denmark, they pay you to go to college. In Germany, too. But not here. In fact, we did the opposite here. But we did try this once. Abraham Lincoln put into place free college. He created 56 land-grant universities. He huge chunks of federal land, gave them to states to create universities. This is where Michigan State University came from. It's where a lot of your state colleges came from. They're called land-grant universities because Lincoln gave them the land so they could be free or low-cost colleges forever. And forever lasted until the Reagan administration. So let's go back to that. Reagan, of course, also had, you know, there was free college in California for almost a century, and then Reagan came in as governor and ended that. Strengthen our public schools back to the world-class quality that we had before the Reagan administration came in and started gutting them, and ban most government money from going to parasitic private schools, particularly the all-white religious schools or religious academies and the for-profit charter schools. Invest in the nation's infrastructure used by the majority of families, from mass transit to community-owned broadband to new public schools and public hospitals, and enforce the nation's antitrust laws to break up these giant monopolies in every sector, particularly media, healthcare, and finance. Pretty straightforward stuff that we can do. And we need to translate this into agenda. And frankly, these are the things that progressive Democrats, progressives across the board, have been pushing for quite some time. And this is, you know, this is the direction FDR was taking us. It's the direction LBJ was taking us. And we hit this screeching halt in the 1980s. And so my call is for us to reverse Reaganism, reverse Reaganomics. And, oh, there it is. And bring us back, bring our American middle class back. Seems like a good idea to me. I realize that conservatives, you know, for a long, long time have blamed the middle class on a whole bunch of, you know, ills, but I say it's time to bring back the middle class. What say you?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And how can we most effectively message that to the rest of America? Democrats like the middle class, Republicans only like oligarchy?